Hello, and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni. I am a published fantasy author and a professional writer and editor with over 10 years of experience in this humble industry. I guess I shouldn't call it humble. It's the publishing industry. It's anything but. All right, folks, today is Thanksgiving. That's right. I'm recording this on a holiday, and to give thanks, I'm going to start with my two wonderful producers for the show, Natalia Emmons and Bridget Sturdock. Thank you so much for what you both do. You are off the hook for this episode of the show. I'm doing this one on my own, which means it's going to be lackluster, but that's okay because I need the experience. I need the training. Sometimes I need to put myself through the ringer. And I thought, you know what would be a fun way to celebrate Thanksgiving for those of you listening who might celebrate Thanksgiving. I know a lot of our Canadian friends celebrate it on a different day, but I do know that the vast majority of people who listen to this podcast are based in the United States. And even if you're not, very happy that you're here as well. Now, I do want to do something that is a little bit different since it is just me. And so I decided, you know what? We have a bunch of comments and questions that have come into the show over the last few weeks. It's been a while since I really dug into some of the listener feedback on the show. So that's what I want to do today. I'm going to take a look at some of the comments that have been coming in on the YouTube channel. For those of you who don't know, the YouTube channel is under my name, John Negroni. That's where Fantasy Writing for Barbarians is published as a podcast. It is still, of course, audio only, but one of these days we'll probably do a video thing. We'll see. It's definitely not something that's high up on my priority list, but yeah, we'll see what happens with that down the road. But okay, I just want to get into it then. We have so many wonderful comments that come in from people who listen to the show, a lot of them subscribers, of course, but also folks who kind of just stumble upon these episodes. And it's always fun to see, because I think that when it comes to fantasy writing, there are a lot of opinions out there, and I'm certainly putting myself out there in a lot of ways to folks who are going to disagree with me a lot, but, plenty of folks who might agree with me as well. So these comments, I've already taken a peek, so I know what most of them pretty much are up to, but there are going to be a few surprises here and there. And then I also want to go through a quick frequently asked questions thing if we have time. There are questions that come in about the show and me in general, or just fantasy writing in general, that we might also be able to touch on as well. So I'm just going to get into it right now. Let's go. All right, I do want to start with this lovely comment that we got from Sammy Rainey X6710, who said, I loved Bridget's input on this one. They're talking about the How to Write Overpowered Protagonists episode. Thanks for another thought-provoking episode. And I just love that one because, yes, Bridget deserves so much credit for a lot of the awesome conversational stuff that we get to put into the show and work into it without. One of the questions we do get is why I don't have a lot of guests. Like, we've had a few guests here and there, but one of the reasons it's usually just me on the microphone is because we want to put out multiple episodes a week, and it's really hard. If you've never done a podcast, I think I've touched on this before. If you've never done a podcast, it's really hard to schedule things with people. It takes a lot more time to edit those episodes, and so the format that we have logistically just leads to us being able to put out more episodes, which is what we want, and with the occasional guest coming in as well. And we are looking to have Bridget on the show, actually on mic pretty soon. And so that's something that I think I've already teased once or twice, and very thrilled to have Bridget come on because they're just such a wonderful human being in general, but also when it comes to the fantasy genre, super knowledgeable, as a lot of you already know. All right, so we have a comment here from Vinny Theory. Vinny Theory is a YouTuber who's commented a few times. And they actually reached out and said that they have some questions that they want to send into the show. So Vinny Theory, if you're listening, be sure to send us those questions. Our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. Just hit us up whenever. But they have this comment here and they say, a writer should search for an idea, and one day a great idea will possess them, so much so that they will be forced to write it. Forcing yourself to write a story just to write a story will result in exactly that, a forced, lackluster story. So this was a comment on our episode about how to unlock your fantasy writing potential. One of my favorite episodes that we've done, honestly. And yeah, this especially came up, I think, with the outline episode we did recently, which is, when it comes to your ideas, ideas are so fleeting. Sometimes an idea will possess you for the first 10 chapters and it just runs out of steam. And then you feel like you're being forced to write it. And it's tricky to get out of that situation. How do you go from being, like the sunk cost fallacy? How do you prevent that? Where you feel like, I'm just writing the story because I already wrote 20,000 words and I don't want to quit or start over or revise or do whatever. And well, that's why we have the outline episode, which is all about helping you take your idea and turn it into an actual story and a workable plot so that you don't feel like you're forcing yourself to write it. You are feeling like, okay, this story has a shape. Now it's my chance to bring that shape into fruition and to mold it and do everything I need to do. It's just really hard to do that before you've really set out like a real plan, a real North Star on what to do next. So that's why that's one of my key pieces of advice that I bring up so often. This is from somebody who's actually a subscriber on the channel, and they commented on how to write female protagonist episode, our longest episode. And this is That Moon's Halo. And they're referring to something I said at minute 5 seconds, or 5:17 to minute seconds 5:17. And I do remember, so I did look this up because I was like, what was this conversation? And I was talking about how, before I get into what Moon's Halo is, I'm going to give you the context. I was talking about in this instance how a lot of readers, and I think I was more implicit on this, but readers and agents and publishers are starting to get very weary of female protagonists who are kind of short, scrawny, don't have any, they're overwritten in terms of like how weak supposedly they are. And then their love interest is this big hulking guy. And so I mentioned that specifically as something that is kind of being like, oh, can we get something a little bit different? It's feeling like that's overdone right now. And so this commenter, That Moon's Halo, wrote, but the current most popular fantasy book that is marketable, or the most current, sorry, let me reread this because I can't read correctly. But the current most popular fantasy books that is marketable, I think they mean that are marketable, are books like Fourth Wing. So I think I brought up Fourth Wing before. I do not like the book Fourth Wing. And a lot of people don't like Fourth Wing in the kind of fantasy genre sphere because it's kind of romantasy at its most, sort of popcorn. It is, and I'm not throwing any shade at Rebecca Yarros here. I think that they wrote a book that has a huge audience, people who really love it, and I obviously could never take that away from them, right? But I would actually say that Moon's Halo, that's part of the reason readers and agents are kind of sick of this, because that book blew up so much and the sequels are still coming out that it is feeling like, oh my gosh, like this again, right? So that what you're talking about is kind of the main instigator for this. I think that to a lesser extent, some of the Sarah J. Maas stuff has contributed to this, although those kinds of characters don't exactly fit what I'm talking about. But so I just brought this up as a really not as a never write a character like this kind of moment. But I think the overall takeaway should probably have is pay attention to the industry, pay attention to what's being published and what's popular. And if you already are doing that, take that information and use it wisely. If your goal is to sell a book that people are going to feel is different, that has like a different kind of place in the landscape of stuff that they can read, yes, you want things to be kind of familiar, but as I tend to say, and I've brought up many times, you also need a fresh original angle, things that are going to make your book stand out a bit more. So if you do have this kind of situation where you have that kind of setup with like the small female protagonist and the like big hulking paramour guy, and you're doing like romantasy, then you're going to have to work a lot harder than you otherwise would have to in order to pitch that as something fresh and original that people won't just scoff at and dismiss without really considering like, oh yeah, maybe it's going to be different. It's the same kind of thing. Like if you wrote this amazing book, but it feels a lot like Hogwarts, like, oh yeah, magical school and a boy who didn't know he was a wizard, you have a huge hill to climb in terms of like, maybe you wrote an amazing book and you have an awesome take on that, but you haven't worked out your premise to really showcase how original you're trying to be. And then people will just see like, oh, it's just like Harry Potter. Like that's boring. Like that's already been done. You know what I mean? So it's a complicated thing. And that's why I would say that paying attention to the industry, paying attention to things that are being published, that sets you up for success. And remember, I'm talking about folks who specifically are writing to be published, traditionally published specifically. This doesn't quite as much apply to self-published authors because a lot of the time their marketing tactics are going to be different. Sometimes they are going to be relying more on pretty established tropes. But even then, I think that it can be tough if you're self-publishing and people are just like, it's just kind of like Fourth Wing, and a lot of folks might be dismissive because the success of Fourth Wing is so overwhelming. There is kind of a backlash to the success of that book that I kind of alluded to earlier. which is that it became so popular that people like to really poke holes in it. Me personally, I do not like that book. I think it's very poorly written, and I found it very frustrating, and I did not finish it. It's just not my kind of book, though. There are a lot of people who Fourth Wing is their kind of book, and I could not, I would be the last person to judge them for it, because I have all kinds of my own kind of what some people might call guilty pleasures, but I just call pleasures. There are books that I like that other people think is garbage, and I don't care, because I just like those books, and you're not going to convince me otherwise. So anyway, hopefully that covers it. And I'm glad, of course, that this commenter is paying attention to, like, hey, this book's really popular, and it is doing something to be successful. Just remember that you want your book you don't want to follow trends, because what happens is everybody then tries to write a Fourth Wing after the success of it, right? Everybody's has been trying to mimic the success of Sarah J. Maas. The problem is that, first of all, we're not those authors. Like, we're not Rebecca Yarros, we're not Sarah J. Maas. Even if you think you're as good of a writer as them, if not better, for whatever reason, and try not to be egotistical on that note, even if you think that you have like the talent to write something as good as them, the thing is, they have huge audiences. They really cut their teeth on building audiences over time. Yarros in particular really kind of came into fantasy with a huge like romance audience. And to that point, I think that you are competing with people who, they have a different arsenal at their disposal compared to you. And what you have is you probably don't have anywhere near that kind of audience. So you don't have the credibility that they have to get away with certain things that you wouldn't be able to get away with. So what ends up happening is there are a lot of authors in your shoes who are trying to basically do the same thing that successful authors are doing. And in a lot of cases, most cases, vast majority of cases, 99.9999%, their stuff's not going to go anywhere, because they're going to try to get it published, and it's not going to have soul. It's not going to have artistic honesty. It's just going to kind of fluff away in the wind. And you don't want to be in that position. You want to write the thing that really is speaking to you, like we were talking about before, something that's an idea that really like possesses you. That's really what you want to chase. Speaking of that commenter, Vinny Theory had another comment here that they commented on the prologues episode. So this episode was when prologues work and when they don't. And I'm very proud of that episode too. I think that it was a tricky one, because prologues can be very contentious. But I was happy to see that we had some good conversation from the community on that. And Vinny Theory weighed in here. They wrote, I think an even bigger issue is no one talks about the fact that people don't know what the word prologue means. For me, growing up, I always thought it meant author's notes, and so I always skipped it, especially when I saw confusing information like an abstract, unrelated backstory. Every time I talk to someone who isn't an avid reader, but maybe read big books like Percy Jackson and Harry Potter, they too have no idea what a prologue means. I think prologues should be chapter ones, like in Harry Potter, and even then are reserved for experienced authors who aren't risking their first book submission to literary agents. I definitely agree with that last part, especially because, yeah, you are just trying to remove roadblocks and red flags that might signify you as not ready, to an agent or to a publisher. And prologues just tend to be one of those things. And it's not always fair. Sometimes people write great prologues, but there are agents in particular who are very averse to prologues, who will immediately dismiss a book. There are plenty of agents who won't either. I listened to that podcast, the S no one tells you about writing. I always mess up the name of that podcast, and I can't do profanity on the show, so I can't say it's the SHIT, no one tells you about writing. And they have like plenty of disagreements on like some of the people that they have on the show like prologues, some don't, some are sort of like it's situational. Again, it really has to do with how experienced you are and how you can pull it off. And me personally, I tend to not even risk it. And I just try to frame and wrap my stories around not needing a prologue in order to avoid that problem. So much of fantasy writing in general is modifying the way you tell a story in order to just make it as easy as possible for the reader so that they can get to the good stuff. You are a caterer for an event in some cases. I know the popular metaphor is, oh, you're like the director, you're the screenwriter, you're the costume designer. Yeah, that's true too. But I also like to think of it like you are putting on an event, you are planning an experience that people are going to be having, and you want all the chairs in the right place. You want to get rid of unruly guests / main characters. You want to just make everything feel like of a piece, and for people to just have no roadblocks or as few roadblocks as possible to get to the good stuff. So anyway, yeah. And then also Vinny Theory commented on the episode where I was talking with Brenna English Loeb, a literary agent for Transatlantic Literary, and we talked about book talk. And I asked Brenna in particular, do you think that TikTok is ruining the book industry, or book talk is? And Vinny says here, book talk is saving books, not killing them. I don't think it's that black and white. I think that, you can refer to that conversation because we had a pretty nuanced conversation about this. It's like, it's doing some good, it's doing some bad. It's kind of up to you to sort of weigh like how much good, how much bad. And it looks like Vinny here would say that more good than bad, much more. I think that there have been like huge success stories thanks to book talk. Books that came out years ago that nobody read, that people would have loved, but then TikTok kind of revives them. And that's awesome to see. And I think that's what they're referring to in particular. But I do also see a lot of problems and pitfalls as book talk is starting to be commodified. It's starting to feel like that sort of organic book club energy is really slipping away, and it's just becoming another sort of hollow, purely money-driven enterprise rather than the sort of honest referral system it used to be. And I say that that's me kind of speculating though and commenting. I'm not an expert on this. And so if you're listening and you're like, John, you're totally wrong, I would not argue with you because this is just not my expertise. This is just something that I've observed that I totally admit I could be 100% wrong about. So I do not want to be, make it sound like I'm some kind of expert on it. That's just what it seems like to me based on my understanding of the industry right now and what I've observed. I'm sure there are tons of examples that would counter what I'm saying. But again, that's why I'm saying it's a bit nuanced. There's a lot of, to me, it seems like there's a lot of good, a lot of bad, and I don't love the direction it's going in based on my insights. But that hopefully that I've caveated that enough so folks don't feel, like I'm coming after them or something like that. Back to the prologues episode, we had another comment here from a frequent commenter and subscriber, Drummer Guy 438. I think we referred to one of their comments in a previous Q&A episode. And Drummer Guy wrote, for that person posing the question, they're referring to the prologues, I fell into the same trap on my first draft. I had a huge chapter that was supposed to be a day in the life of the main character. So when his life changes, we see a similar day in the life, but everything is different or wrong. I won't go into the plot, but he gets possessed, so he then goes to an exorcist. On reread, it was super boring, so I cut it all. Now the story starts when he knocks on the door of the exorcist's office. It is so much more interesting. My point is that what feels like too late in the story probably isn't. So I think we already talked about this comment already a couple of weeks ago. And so I won't repeat, of course, what we talked about already, but I just wanted to bring that up again because I just think it's so wonderful to see that folks are, the advice I'm giving, it's not like I'm coming up with this stuff because I'm some kind of genius. A lot of it is experience. A lot of it is stuff that you will also figure out. It's just like I'm trying to help folks figure stuff out or learn stuff about what they're working on, maybe a little bit sooner, so they have a little bit less of a pain process. All right, we had a comment here, another comment from Sammy Rainey X6710, and they commented on the writing advice episode we did, again, with Brenna English Loeb, the literary agent. And Sammy wrote, this had some interesting insights. I think new writers overlook the querying part of that process, but being able to pitch a story before writing it might make the whole creative process run smoother. Couldn't have said it better myself. That is 100% what I personally believe. And when I kind of realized this and learned this myself, it just, smoother is the right word. It doesn't mean that your creative process, it's not like you're going to have problems or that you're not going to make huge changes as you go. But it really just makes that, especially that first part of writing the story and a lot of the second part, so much easier. Because when you know how you're going to pitch it, you have like a sense of like what your story really is and how it's going to come across and what you need to accomplish with it. And it makes the querying process so much easier. It's really hard to write a whole book, write a draft and have it edited, have a bunch of people read it, and then you have to come up with the pitch. And it's like, if you haven't really put thought into like, what are your hooks and what is your plan? Like, it's not necessarily a business plan, but it's kind of similar in the sense of like, how are you going to find success with this? And for a lot of people, they end up giving up because they're like, well, I didn't really think of this ahead of time and I didn't really consider this from that angle. So now I'm going to maybe just self-publish it for free or something like that. And that's great if that's something that you're content with, of course. But if you don't want that to be your end goal and you want to be able to find some success with this in some situation, I would say like my success with getting responses from agents and getting manuscript requests, no question, it's like a difference, like exponential difference in terms of like how much better, suited you are to get into like a published deal if you take this approach, where you really consider what is your book, what are the hooks, what's the premise, what's the pitch ahead of time. I cannot recommend it enough. I'm probably going to say it 1,000 more times as we record episodes of this show. We had an episode called How to Master Your Magic System. This is another one, very popular episode, and I was happy to see that people really liked it. And we had a commenter weigh in here. This is Andrew TR6, and they wrote, "My main focus when creating a magic system is considering how it affects the world it exists in. If the magic can do literally anything with very little cost, then there shouldn't be many problems left. Many magic systems can heal wounds, cure disease, create food, transport people across vast distances, and instantly create structures. Right there, you've just met all the basic needs people need. In order to have conflict in a story, there need to be problems that magic can't solve. I've been developing my magic system for a while now, but what I haven't been able to decide is when it's complete. It's a hard magic system with a lot of small pieces. I don't think it's overly complex, but I am trying to cover a lot. The best way to describe it is like a kitchen sink magic system. Trained mages are able to do a lot with it in a Doctor Strange type of way. To tie the magic together, I use sigils as a visual element, which I think will work great since I intend for this to be a comic. Both in and out of the story, sigils can be used to infer what spell is being cast by reading the symbols they're made of. I know I still have more to work out, but I'm still curious, when will I know I'm done?" I would honestly say, like, it's possible that it doesn't have to be done, right? I think sometimes you can say, like, there's more to this magic system, and I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to move forward with the information that I reveal now to the reader. And I think it's done when you feel like you've said enough with it to tell the story. And if you come up with more things down the road, then you can add to that. So one of the classic, examples of a magic system that has been very successful in recent times especially is Brandon Sanderson's Allomancy. And that's the fun of Allomancy. I know I've talked about this a bunch, I think, in that episode. But the thing with Allomancy, it's basically, for those of you who haven't read Mistborn, it's basically metal bending, but you literally consume metals, and consuming different metals allows you to have different metallic types of powers. And one of the really cool things that Sanderson was able to do with that magic system is he was able to add to it over time. And he was never, you could say Brandon Sanderson wasn't done because he left room for him to improve upon the magic system. So there was like a sort of complete understanding of Allomancy, right? In the sense that, like, yeah, you burn these types of metals and this is what happens. But part of the fun of the series, the books, is that the main character is really clever and they basically figure out new ways to ingest new metals for new powers. So it's actually better that way, because then it feels like the magic system has even more mystery and intrigue. Like, who knows what could happen next? And you're able to do that without making it a soft magic system where it just kind of feels like the writer is inventing new rules out of thin air, right? But if you put in new complications and twists to the magic system, that is something that people are going to find more believable and also is going to make the story exciting. Another great example of this would be Avatar: The Last Airbender, specifically The Legend of Korra. But even if you go to Avatar: The Last Airbender, one thing that gets introduced in the second season is that, well, firebenders, not only can they bend fire, but they can also bend lightning, and they can like turn that around. And then also we learned that earthbenders can do metal bending. And then in Legend of Korra, they just continue to add to this lore. You have guys who can do lava bending, right? And blood bending, of course, is one of the famous examples of like, oh my gosh, yeah. So the implications of your magic system, if you are doing it right, and I know you're talking about sigils and things like that, I would say that as long as it's organic to the magic system you're setting up, you don't have to feel like it all has to be figured out. Everything has to be written down and perfected. And I say that as somebody who, I'm not the best at magic systems. I'm just not. The most recent magic system I have put together, I think is really cool, but it's also a bit more sort of wacky, and it's not really supposed to be this like very meticulous, like, all of these rules to it or anything like that. It's really just kind of like a vehicle to tell an exciting story for my own purposes. It's kind of this like fortune telling magic system. And I love just like letting it have its own sort of evolving rule set where it's like sometimes like I've come up with like new complications to it. The key, of course, is to always be mindful that it's not going to be feeling like anything can happen and that takes the tension out, right? But it seems like you're on the right track. I think that you are it seems to me at least, you are giving this a lot of thought, and beta readers especially are going to help you kind of fill in the gaps maybe that you're worried about. A lot of them are going to be able to be like, hey, you didn't really think of this, but logically, maybe your magic system could use a little bit of thought here or some clarification here. I know I rely on beta readers for that sort of thing all the time. All right, we also had a comment on this episode, Sola Labelle 9674, and they wrote, today I learned the Pixar Theory guy is a fantasy author with a YouTube channel. I've had a YouTube channel for a long time. I've had multiple ones, and I've been podcasting since 2014, so over 10 years now. But yes, I am the Pixar Theory guy. For folks who don't know, I wrote the Pixar Theory blog post in 2013, and the book that went along with it. That's going to be probably my next book that is going to be republished, because it was published years ago, but we are redoing it. And it's tricky though, because they just keep on releasing movies. But yes, that is one thing that has been on my, I don't want to say bingo card, because it happened. It's on my character sheet, to borrow a Bridget Surdock term, because they are, of course, a dungeon master for Dungeons and Dragons. Anyway, what else do we have here? Oh yeah, here's another comment from Sammy Rainey. They wrote on the How to Unlock Your Fantasy Writing Potential. Thanks for your point of view, John. It was a pleasure to listen to. OP's post resonated with me as well. The pull between yearning to put to paper the ideas living inside me and some unnameable dread caused by trying to actually do the thing. I hope their passion guides them through this uncertain time. Yeah, I remember just really feeling, what that writer was going through. I know we sent them the episode on Reddit. Natalia let me know that they appreciated the episode, and it seemed like we helped. That's one of my favorite things about doing this show. Bridget and Talia and I get to hear back from the people who write these prompts, and a lot of you folks, of course, as we're doing now, who genuinely seem to just really appreciate, taking the time to give some feedback, not just feedback, but just some kind of professional support, emotional support in some cases. All right, this is another Sammy comment, but this was from How to Create Fantastical Worlds That Aren't Overwhelming. That was another episode I enjoyed. It seemed like they, I had this quote and they said, let me just read it. It can be really fun to just create your own world. This is something I said in the episode. But if your passion is writing, you have to come to grips with some of the limitations of what a novel has to do in order to function. And they wrote, oof, touche. Yeah, it's one of the toughest things to accept that, your imagination, it can feel endless at times. Sometimes it doesn't feel endless. Sometimes your imagination feels like your worst enemy. But in the times when you feel like you have all these ideas and you just want to write a novel, like I feel this tension when I want to write a book that's like 200,000 words. I'm like, I want my story to be this long. I want to have all these POV characters. But then I look at the reality and I'm like, if I make a book this long, the novel doesn't function. And honestly, as writers, in some ways, we have it much easier, right? Compared to, think of like screenwriters, think of directors, people who make movies and TV shows. I mean, they have, like for the TV show, they might have a series, but they have so many more limitations on their imagination because they have to rely on budgets and like having to be able to like actually make a thing visually that makes sense, and that all of these people have to work on and guide in one direction. I mean, it's hard work. And so we have, I guess, a less strict set of rules. So of course we can appreciate that for ourselves, right? We can find the stuff in there that makes sense for us. All right. And then we have one last one here. This is again on how to create fantastical worlds that aren't overwhelming, in that episode as well. This is from Kellen Jones 9930. Not great advice, to be honest. I don't know how anyone could picture themselves in a world like Garland's Annihilation or Interstellar, but the idea is to go deeper instead of wider. The OP's fantasy world sounds dope, and I have questions about the seasons, crops, hibernation of species, other celestial bodies, the makeup of gases and the atmosphere, this tree of life, etc. So deeper, as opposed to wider, new races coming up from underground, interdimensional extraterrestrial invasion, magical items, weapons, colonization of this new outer space because of the degradation of the old world, etc. All of which would be overwhelming for the reader, especially in a one-off and not in a series. But even a series needs to be parallel and call back to Act 1. The weird thing about this comment is I think that we aren't necessarily disagreeing. I think what they're saying, like they're saying to go deeper instead of wider. That's what I'm saying as well. I think what I'm saying is to pick a few things to go deeper. Because the thing is, if you try to go deep on everything like you're saying, then it's going to be too wide and you're going to run out of room to tell your story. It's going to feel too much like a textbook at that point. But yes, the core of what you're saying is correct. Like finding ways to go deeper on a few things and in a way that still functions within the context of your story is the way to go. And that's what I'm saying as well. You don't want to have all of this, like this book being too many things. I really enjoy this book. I think I've brought this up before. Divine Rivals. I forget the name of the author of that one. Maybe it might be another Rebecca or something. But I like Divine Rivals and I like Ruthless Vows. It's a duology, so those two books together. But my main criticism with that book is it was too many things. And I remember there's a podcast I enjoy that I remember they were much harsher on the book. Unresolved Textual Tension, a great YouTube channel. I love to check in on their takes as well. But I remember they were saying kind of a similar thing where with Divine Rivals, it was just, there were so many like world building quirks to it because they had this stuff with like gods and they had this stuff with like the magical typewriter and then they had like a World War II thing, but then they also had the romantic thing. It was just like so many things. And I wish that they had like simplified it a little bit more. Now, I still really enjoyed the book. I think the book still works, but that was just like my main criticism was that there were times when all of these different too many things were competing with each other too much. And that was just frustrating, honestly. But I still recommend those books. Those are books that I think TikTok, actually, Book Talk specifically, helped kind of popularize. So maybe that's another example of a Book Talk being for good. Because I personally, I like that book, even if a lot of folks might not have. But all right, I think that's about it for the comments and everything. And maybe we can finish on a frequently asked question for the show, something we've been asked quite a bit. And so I'm going to refer to my notes, though, because I had something written down about this. Oh, yeah. Somebody wanted to know, when are we going to talk about action scenes, specifically writing effective battle or combat scenes? That would be a great list, or a great topic to bring up. I would love to talk about action scenes. I very much enjoy writing them. And yeah, one of the things, and this ladders into another question we've been asked, is like, how do we pick the topics? Again, I don't have a ton of say in the topics, as a lot of you already know. Natalia is the one who kind of helps plan the show in that regard. So Natalia, as our producer, her role is to find these prompts, and she sends them to me, of course, and I read them. And the guidance I give her is to just kind of like pay attention to what's being posted, in the fantasy writing forums. What are people asking about, talking about? Because what we want to do is we want to find the organic prompts, the stuff that's being written right now that people are curious about and having conversations about. And then, of course, us weighing in as we can. And so that's really what guides this. There have only been a few times when I've gone to Natalia and been like, we should probably do an episode like this. And that specifically, we did that for the outline episode. So that's an example. And in terms of like combat scenes, I guess it'll come down to, whenever we find a really good prompt and Natalia thinks that it's ready for prime time, and we can bring it up on the show. But that said, that's why we are so open, of course, to people who listen to the show asking us questions and sending us stuff, whether it be in the YouTube or it be in our email and everything, or in the Discord, wherever it is, and just letting us know, like, what are you curious about? And, would love to do more stuff from the listeners. And also, if you want us to critique things, that's always something that very much willing to do, especially when we have times when want to make things a little bit easier for Bridget and Natalia, give them some time off, and critiques are a little bit easier for me to do on my own. But that said, I am very, very happy that we were able to spend some Thanksgiving together. Hope this was a bit of a meal, and that I hope I don't have a stomach ache after this, because that was a lot of talking. But thank you so much for listening. Always love doing the show, and happy, of course, to take some time off for myself as well. So we'll be back soon, of course, to talk more about fantasy writing. But in the meantime, be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.